We focus on South Africa now. Headline inflation coming down 6.9% year on year from 7.2%. That's headline. However, food inflation in South Africa spiking to 13.8% year on year from 12.7% according to Stats South Africa. Of course, you know that the central bank, or rather the Reserve Bank of South Africa, has been hiking rates. We're going to look at the triggers behind this, what it means for the economy, and what it means especially also for the average South African that's trying to purchase food. Our guest is in Pretoria, South Africa. He is Wandile Sihlobo. He's the Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa. He's also a senior lecturer extraordinary at the Department of Agricultural Economics at the Stellenbosch University and a visiting research fellow at the Wits School of Governance, University of Witwatersrand. And he was appointed as a member of President Cyril Ramaphosa's Presidential Economic Advisory Council in 2019 and reappointed in 2022, having served on the Presidential Expert Advisory Panel on Land Reform and Agriculture from 2018. It's a pleasure having you, Mr. Sihlobo. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to start off and ask you why the rapid increase in food inflation in South Africa.
Thanks for having me on. I think what we're seeing now in South Africa on food price inflation really reflects what for many months we have been observing from agricultural commodity side, and it's starting to filter through now into the retail side. And you will remember that between the farm prices and what we get to see in retailers, there's usually a lag of about 3 to 4 months for a number of products, and we see that filtering through in South Africa. But of course, we do have also our own domestic challenges. If you think about the meat industry in South Africa, we've been struggling with what we call the foot and mouth disease, which has negatively affected the livestock industry, and of course led to lower slaughtering in the cattle industry side. And we see that also coming up when you look at the meat prices. And it's almost a similar story with vegetables and fruits. There's been excessive rains, which disrupted production in some of the northern regions of the country. And taking all of those factors together with those global dynamics that I talked about is what is leading to this increase that you see in food price inflation in South Africa, while much of the world is starting to see a bit of moderation.
So thank you so much for the breakdown. Are you fine with the weighting of the food basket in South Africa? I think there's, I think 35% is attributed to meats, and then you've got like 21% for fruits and so on. Well, cereals rather, and then the rest. Does that need to be rejigged, or is that okay? How do you see the weighting of the food basket?
We actually see that fairly fine. And I mean, our statistics agency, Stats South Africa, has recently done a reweighting of that, looking at, of course, the poverty levels, looking at expenditure and all of the other dynamics. And we deem that to be fairly appropriate the way that it's measured in South Africa. But it also, though, which is an important insight in here, gives you an indication of saying what are some of the products within the food basket that tend to drive that headline number of consumer food price inflation, being the grains and cereals side, which the bread also included on that, as well as meat being one of those key. And then I would add there to say, if you think about oils and fats, those gets also to be the key important product when you try to get an understanding of what's the trend of the food price inflation in South Africa. You really have to focus and look at those products. But overall weighting, I think I'm comfortable with how it's done, and our statistics agency continuously reviewed these weightings.
And as far as the triggers for meat, which since it has the largest weighting, and we saw that, the spike there, is the issue with, I think I heard about, in fact, your article, I read your article on this. You mentioned foot and mouth disease and some other issues as far as the triggers for meat prices rising.
Yeah, absolutely. There is this disease, which is called foot and mouth disease, as you rightly put it. And of course, this spread to a record level in South Africa. Typically, we would have it in about 3 of our 9 provinces. But for the first time now, we saw foot and mouth disease spreading in about 6 of our 9 provinces. What that meant then is that it also affected some of the biggest feedlots, leading to a situation where the feedlots that would have typically slaughtered a certain number of cattle a month, they had to reduce that. For example, a month in South Africa, we would slaughter roughly about 300,000 head of cattle. And then we saw that being reduced to levels around about nearly 200,000 head of cattle a month. That has implications when you're thinking about the meat prices, and which was one of the key drivers of food price inflation, which you're seeing at this moment. But of course, you would add there also to say poultry prices in general remain relatively elevated to a certain extent, and that feeds into that food price inflation story that you're seeing, and meat being one of the drivers.
Okay, and then what about the triggers for bread and cereals, which I think has the second largest weighting in the basket? What about the triggers behind that increase?
The triggers on the bread and cereal, I mean, there you're pretty much looking at wheat as well as the maize prices. I mean, globally, it's a story that you've covered it in this show for some time when you think about the Russia-Ukraine war and the implication of that in global grain prices, as well as the droughts that we saw in parts of Indonesia. Adding on that, in South America, there was a drought also contributing to an increase in the global grain prices. South Africa is interlinked with the global environment. And all of those increases of March of last year, we are seeing them now pretty much transpire when we think about the grain-related food products. And we also have to appreciate that South Africa still imports about half of its annual wheat consumption. That's about 1.5 million tons. While, of course, then on maize, we are net exporters. But the prices that you see in Johannesburg are pretty much determined by events that are happening in South America, in the Black Sea, or somewhere in the US. So it was more of a global environment driving the dynamics that we see here. But I must emphasize one thing here. The energy prices have also been part and parcel of these increases that you are seeing in here, because much of this food has to be processed somewhere, and the energy costs have been going up, and that is one of the key input costs when you think about prices of food.
Thank you. In fact, yeah, we might as well jump on that right now. Eskom, the load shedding, we understand that's going to continue. So if you look at the outlay, or how far along this is going to be impacting prices, did we see all of that in January, or is load shedding going to continue to be a pressure point for food prices in terms of what you've talked about now for processing of foods?
Now, I mean, you hit the nail on the head on that to say load shedding intensified a lot from January. Now, when we're looking at the inflation data for January, already we know that much of the load shedding impact is not factored in those numbers. So when we think about February and March numbers, that's where we will continue to see the impact of load shedding into those prices. And how this comes about is this: firms that cannot get sufficient power, they had to put generators. Some had to invest in some alternative energy sources, solar system, biogas, and all of those. All of those investments, they bring extra costs. And those extra costs then, they have to a certain extent be factored in the final products, which is why then we're saying on a food dynamics, we do anticipate that the energy prices that are related to some of these new investments that people are making will come out in the food products. And of course, then we should see this from February, March going into May, but I wouldn't expect it to be a more prolonged situation, because as we speak, the South African government, particularly the Ministry of Agriculture, is looking at some of the interventions that could be made to ensure that farmers are slightly better off and not heavily affected by the load shedding in as far as the irrigation activity and all of those things. Similarly, with the food processors and packaging companies and retailers, to say what intervention can be put in place to ensure that they continue with their activity so that the supply of food is not interrupted by these power outages that we see in much of South Africa at the moment.
Thank you so much for that. I want to talk to you quickly about rainfall. There's a tweet we have from you. I follow you, by the way, so I saw this tweet from you where you said the rainfall of the past few days in most regions of South Africa has helped improve crop growing conditions and grazing yield. There are, however, communities where rains have done worse than good. So how do we square that? He says still the overall picture from an agricultural perspective is positive, because I think rainfall had an impact on fruits and vegetables, right, as far as inflation prices for that part of the basket.
No, I mean, 100% correct. And I think that the intensity of that rain, which is referring to, is over the past 2 weeks. We've had severe rainfall in South Africa. And in fact, if you look at the local news, there are stories in the East Coast regions of South Africa where there's been massive disruption. For example, in areas like East London, PE, those are some of the areas that have experienced a bit of difficulties in there. But broadly looking at agricultural conditions, I still think that South Africa is better off, to the extent that for this year, we expect food price inflation in the country to average at around about 7% compared to 9.5% last year. So yes, month-on-month numbers will remain elevated, maybe until May. And then from May, June this year, you could see inflation moderating. And those increases leading into May will be related to the point that you are alluding to, as well as the energy cost issues that we had discussed earlier.
Final question for you. Climate change, impact of climate change on farm produce, the land, the farmers themselves, their output. Is this as existential as, is being talked about globally?
It's a major thing. And I think all of us as Africans, we need to be paying attention here. And what I think we need to be investing in is either better seeds varieties that can be able to withstand some of these harsh conditions, because already we are hearing now the talks and the forecast of a potential El Nino in the coming season. That's 2023-2024 season. What that means in much of Southern Africa, and indeed even in West Africa, we're likely to see a better drier weather conditions, while in East Africa, if you think about Kenya, Ethiopia, they might receive fairly a good rainfall in that area. And of course, while we've enjoyed all of these good showers, it's been very tough for much of East Africa with drought during a La Nina. Now we're going to an opposite. And I think that at the African continent, we have to be thinking of saying, how do we farm better in this climate changing environment?
Thank you so much for a very in-depth conversation, Mr. Wandile Sihlobo, Chief Economist of the Agricultural Business Chamber of South Africa, also the author of Finding Common Ground, Land, Equity and Agriculture. Thank you so much for joining us. Really appreciate your time.